And this comes from the Tomorrow Cities project that's already been outlined, just around this particular diagram, which helps us to think through possibly what the implications of COVID are for resilient cities. On the left-hand side is meant to be a representation of the ways in which risk is conceived in its relationship to development before COVID, particularly from the climate change community. So you have a single risk domain, climate change risk. That's the topic of interest for research and policy. That's responded to primarily, you see this sort of big circle, by adaptation. So resilience is all about adaptation policy. There's early warning to do with climate change, lots of flexible production from economic but also social life. Vulnerability reduction is acknowledged as an element of building resilience, but really the bulk of emphasis is on trying to produce flexible systems, flexible livelihoods, redundancy in urban infrastructure, and so on. Poverty alleviation is part of that, but I would argue hasn't been at the forefront. And of course, there's post-event management, which is about returning to, by and large, the pre-disaster moment. And in fact, there's very few examples of that. Most post-disaster tend to return to a worse state, either because people are forced to relocate or livelihoods aren't reconstructed. So that's a characterization of where we have been up until now. And COVID, of course, interacts in many very wicked ways with COVID, and that's been alluded to by the presentations. Those individuals, neighborhoods, urban areas which are already weakened because of development injustices or climate impacts will of course be least able to cope with the additional health and perhaps even more importantly the economic consequences of lockdowns and curfews and so on associated with COVID. So we have a concentration of the combined impacts of COVID and other risks like climate risks, but also air pollution, I would imagine, in cities. This intensification of vulnerability. And that provokes us to think differently about risk. So the second diagram is a prospective one. So do we think that one of the legacies of COVID will be to shift a whole range of policy debates which are already live but have not been successful yet at changing the way that risk is managed in cities or resilience is built? So, will COVID help us think less about single risks, climate change, health, economic insecurity, physical violence, and look at how those risks intersect, which we know is the way that particularly the urban poor, but all of us actually have to live with risk. We're constantly juggling multiple risks. Can research and maybe policy move to better represent that complexity? In terms of the real shifts in management, then of course, we still need adaptive policy. We still need early warning and flexible, perhaps increasingly local production. But I'd argue that what COVID has really shown us is that we have neglected vulnerability reduction. So we've neglected primary health care, equal access to education, secure livelihoods, social security across all dynamics, urban migrants, gender, age, and so on. That to me is the biggest lesson. To reduce risk, one has to confront vulnerability and build resilience. Building resilience is not a replacement for those underlying concerns. If we're to reduce vulnerability, then we have to really face some ongoing, persistent, difficult challenges in our societies. Reducing vulnerability is not just about mending the superficial expressions of injustice and inequality, but really looking at those root causes, which are historical, to do with power relations, which reach into political systems, decision making, and so on. So this is the real challenge, I think, that COVID enlivens within us. And of course, finally, we have a mantra already of building back better, no, not returning to the old normal. There's a lot of work around a greener future. And I guess this way of framing the conversation that we've begun to have today already suggests that social justice should be a big part of this building back better. If we can get there through root causes of risk, dynamic vulnerability, and so on, that maybe shows us something of a pathway. So I should probably finish there. It's very kind of you to allow me to make this short intervention. So I hope it's useful, and I've certainly appreciated the presentation so far. So thank you.